Today I'm going to tell you how you can win your games in just 2 minutes. 9th edition Necron Tactics, and it's coming right up.
Necrons!
Nick speaking, and welcome to this video. Right, I have been playing games of Warhammer 40k at last. The lockdown in the UK is over, and I've been playing games, getting some real experience with the Codex and 9th edition under my belt, and well, I want to make videos now, proper videos of my experience on the table. And today I'm going to share what you should be doing during a game to help you win that game, and it's only going to take you around 2 minutes. Now, this isn't necessarily just for Necrons. It would work with any army, and any player should be doing this before they play their game to increase their chances of winning. And it's pretty simple, and that is making sure the terrain is correct. Now, I'm not talking about having the correct amount of terrain. We all know you need a good amount of terrain in 9th edition. Not enough and the game is one-sided. Too much terrain and the game can be one-sided the other way. So we want a nice happy medium amount of terrain. However, what I'm talking about is correctly allocating to the pieces of the terrain before the game, because if you don't do this properly, well, it can have a big impact on your army. And let's face it, Necrons need as much help as they can get these days, what with the Codex creep, etc. So let's go table down and have a look at some of my notes that I print out and have by my army list to remind me on what to do, and hopefully these tips will be useful to you. Okay, so what I've done is I've broken down these tips into segments that I want to share, and then at the end I'm going to share the sheet that I take with me. So the first thing to note with terrain is there's two things about them. You've got terrain features and terrain traits. So first of all, let's have a look at the features, which is pretty simple and easy to remember. So the key three features are hills, which basically is terrain that just don't do anything except just block line of sight normally. You then have obstacles, which are pieces of terrain that give you a +1 to your cover save for infantry, beasts and swarms if you're within 3 inches, unless again you've got full line of sight. And then you've got area terrain, which is +1 to cover save for infantry, beasts and swarms when you are within the actual terrain piece. So it's definitely worth working out which pieces of terrain are obstacles. So that could be, for example, on a Necron board, it could be an obelisk where, well, you can't literally stand in that obelisk, but if you nominate it as being an obstacle, that means if you're within 3 inches, you do get a terrain if you do get the cover save if you are slightly obscured. So 3 things to remember there. Now, of course, we have buildings as well, also now known as fortifications, but they have their own set special rules. And of course, if you're playing a player which is using a fortification, well, you can communicate with them on that. So I'd ignore fortifications for now. Just remember those 3 key things: hills, basically do nothing, obstacles, and area terrain to give you a +1 cover save. But bearing in mind it's only infantry, beasts and swarms. Okay, so let's scroll down my notes and we then come to terrain traits. And I've just listed what I feel are the key ones. So first of all, we've got obscuring, which of course I think everyone knows. I mean, I did this myself when I first started playing. You basically looked at the table, said, okay, which buildings are obscuring, because it seems the most important one, and let's face it, it probably is the most important one. So you've got obscuring, which is basically terrain which is over 5 inches or 5 inches or taller, and they totally block line of sight to your models. So great, obscuring. We then have light and heavy cover. Now these are 2 separate entries, but I've put them together because I think they need to be together. So if you nominate a piece of terrain to be light cover, then you get a +1 save from ranged attacks, and if you nominate it as heavy cover, you get a +1 save from melee attacks. However, this is for anyone, not just infantry, beasts and swarms. So when you're allocating a piece of terrain as an area piece of terrain, if you can allocate that to be light cover or heavy cover, then especially if it's in a deployment zone, it's going to give you those extra benefits, which is really useful, especially for Necrons. Now obviously you have to look at the physical look of the piece of terrain when you start allocating things, but yeah, if you can allocate something light cover and heavy cover, that's a great advantage for your Necrons in both being shot at and also if they get into assault. So not just allocating it as area terrain, but try to allocate what you can, especially terrain pieces which are in deployment zones, as light and heavy cover. Okay, now next would be defensible. Any infantry unit on or in area terrain, if not in engagement range, can hold steady or set to defend when charged. So you have an option to use either one of these. Hold steady gives you a 5+ overwatch as opposed to a 6+, and then if you set to defend you get +1 to hit in close combat. So both of those very useful, and if you're not making use of this particular terrain trait, then I highly recommend that you do, especially for Necrons. I mean, overwatching with a big blob of warriors or immortals on an objective on a 5+, yes, you've got to pay 1 CP to be able to overwatch, but still it's pretty nice, and even having +1 to hit in close combat, pretty useful. So defensible, if you can make pieces of terrain that look like they should be a defensed piece of terrain, maybe a ruined building where you've just got rubble on the floor and it's a bit more dense, you could maybe make it defensible plus light cover and heavy cover. Pretty useful. Now next is breachable. Now this isn't a game changer, but it's worth noting this on the table just so that everyone is quite clear about this. So breachable means that infantry, beasts and swarms can move through walls. I've put walls on my sheet, but anything basically where your models may either have to move around it or they can go through it. It just saves any confusion on the table. If you nominate a building or a piece of terrain as breachable, then everyone knows that people can walk through the walls, and if it's not nominated, you have to walk around them. So it's worth noting this. It's not necessarily a game changer, although it could help. And then lastly, we've got scalable, which is basically terrain with levels. So again, this is not a game changer, but it's worth noting these particular rules basically for anything that's got more than one level, 1 or 2 levels going up. So scalable means that only infantry, beasts, swarms and fly can go on the top of the feature, and only infantry, beasts, swarms can move through the floors and ceilings. In other words, go up and down the building through those floors. So again, it's not a game changer, but it's worth noting these things so that everyone knows exactly what the terrain piece does on the table. Now there are some other traits which we're going to look at right now, but those are the ones which I think you'll be better to learn more than these ones coming up. And you don't want to learn too much, it just confuses things. And with my nice little breakdown, which I'm going to have at the end of this video, you'll see that a small amount of good information can really change the game. So let's have a quick look at some of the other traits. So you've got dense cover, which are things like forests, where if you're within 3 inches of the feature you get -1 to hit. There's a few exceptions. It's slightly complicated, this rule, but you don't tend to have this feature on the table very often. You have unstable, which is basically the old impassable feature where you just can't stand your men on there. So if you do have a piece of terrain which is difficult to stand your men, you could just say, okay, that's unstable, so no one can basically stand on it. You've got difficult terrain, which is -2 when moving, advancing, and falling back and assaulting, which could be useful. You could say, well, okay, maybe one of my defending pieces of terrain would be useful to have this particular ability, because it means if someone's assaulting you, then they're -2 inches. However, you have to be a little bit careful of this, because of course Necrons are very slow moving, so you don't want to hamper them too much. You've got exposed, so basically no cover save on the top of something, so you might have an obelisk with a flat top, and you could say, well, that's exposed. If you stand on there, you don't get a save. Just complicating things a little. There are special rules for a defense line if someone's using that, so maybe you could allocate that to like a barricade. Within 1 inch you can be charged, and you can fight within 2 inches of it. And then you have another one which is inspiring, which I quite like. It's a +1 leadership if you're wholly within 6 inches of this terrain. So if I had, for example, a Necron, I don't know, say orb on the table, I could say, okay, with my armies within 6 inches, I get +1 to leadership. I think it's a bit unfair if you don't have 2 inspiring pieces of terrain for both armies on the table. So don't know you'll be using this that often, but it's another trait to bear in mind. Okay, so now let's have a look at my final notes on what I think is a good way to allocate terrain at the beginning of the game. Nice and easy and simple, but also give you a much better chance of winning because you've got some good terrain features on the table. Okay, so here are my notes. Declare these with your opponents before the game. Definitely worth doing. So we've already discussed, obviously, hills, area terrain, obstacles, and obscuring. Those are the 4 main things. However, you want to start adding a few extra pieces if you can to them. I think the most important 2 things for you to be adding is light cover and heavy cover. Well, those are 2 different traits, but I think they come in the same one, and if you can allocate heavy and light to 1 piece of terrain, it's going to benefit you more. So the other one, of course, is defensible, because I think holding steady for that 5+ Overwatch, and also the +1 to hit in close combat when you defend, you have to choose one or the other, but I think it's a good feature to have on the terrain, especially in your deployment zones near objectives. Now, of course, your opponent is going to get these particular abilities as well, so you could say, well, okay, it's just evening out the battlefield, or maybe it is evening out the battlefield, but I think it gives you an advantage as a Necron player because you need all the help that you can get. So yeah, I definitely think you should be looking at allocating light and heavy cover to those area pieces of terrain, especially the ones in deployment zones, and then of course defensible if you can as well, because again, that's really useful. Now, the other ones which I put down right at the end is breachable, because it's very handy to know what can move through walls and what can't, and scalable because it's very handy to know what can go up and down. I think that's just a good general rule. It's not necessarily there to try and benefit you from anything, but I think it's worth noting. So breaking it down into 3 simple sections just makes it so much easier to do. So you can just run over with your opponent. Okay, so that's going to be a hill. Let's make this area. This is obviously an obstacle. That's an obstacle. And then these 3 big buildings in the middle are obscuring. And then you can say, okay, so that's that. How about we make this area a piece of terrain here, light cover, maybe this one light and heavy cover and defensible. And then you can just run through those extra bits just to put that extra abilities on the pieces of terrain, just to try and help you out. Then of course you can just make sure that everyone knows about the buildings being breachable and scalable. Now, I know some of you are probably doing all of this already. However, there may be a lot of you out there just like me who just haven't really played much of 9th edition or the Necron Codex, and hopefully these little tips will be useful to you, because I, for one, know that when I go to a game, I generally just look to see what's obscuring and what is going to give me a cover save. And I think this, going forward, is going to help me a lot. Hopefully it will help you. Today what's that flashing for? Today I'm going to tell you how you can win your Today I'm going to tell you how you can win your games in just 2 minutes. And it's coming. Water needed. Stop recording. Now if you want to see some of my other Necron Tactical videos, then I'll link you up to a playlist just there for you to watch next.